I appreciate it. There's a lot of folks here, so I shouldn't be joking and carrying on about this. Appreciate all you guys coming out. As you well know, our Friday series is once a month, and we go back and forth between technical topics and business topics. This is kind of a business psychology / social. It's really not a hard business. It's more of a human relations, HR kind of focused topic, so it's kind of interesting. So Liz just sent me a note basically after one of the Fridays saying she wanted to do a presentation on working with jerks. And immediately she got my attention. I was like, holy cow. I mean, this woman's near and dear to me. And so then I started doing a little bit of digging basically into what she did. And she started out actually at Amoco, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit. But so I went into and started to dig a little bit, and I was intrigued by something else I'll get to in just a minute. But started Amoco, I guess in Chicago, would have to be, and then ended up in San Francisco working for a company called Mercer Delta, which HR consultancy.
Change consulting.
Change consulting.
Yeah, David Namers.
But at the end of the day, basically, if you look at who Liz has worked with, it's impressive. So she's kind of results oriented, award winning. And I think, it's funny because when I was writing this, I took like a whole page and cut it into a half. And it says coach, consultant, and trainer. And I actually realized that there is a difference between all of those things. And author, who's passionate about two things, organizational change and communications. Very, very important in an organization. What I love is she relocated in 2014. And this community just continues to get great, experienced people, basically, who are now coming out and sharing the knowledge of this community and making it better. So thank you for being here. But I think, what's also interesting is as I read through her little bio on her website, so she helps leaders turn blue sky thinking into action. I think you call it green pasture thinking. I couldn't tell basically green pasture from brownfield, so I just took that out. And that's very important, right? The way I kind of tell people, I said it's the difference between a leader and a crackpot is a guy who just goes around talking about what he thinks, and then when you look at what he's actually done, there's nothing there. So before she started Connect in 2004, which is her own consultancy firm, again started in Amoco. This is very interesting. And this is especially interesting to me now, getting ready to send a kid out to college. Liz is also a self-proclaimed education junkie who earned 3 degrees, and not like, I should say tech, not a technical school, but actually at established universities for $5,000. This is crazy. I mean, as I'm getting ready to send my kid off to college for $68,000 a year, So she funded it through higher education. Her funder had through scholarships, work study, and company tuition reimbursement plans. So she's, among other things, what she didn't put was she was also very resourceful, and I think that's always great. So without further ado, Liz Guthridge, and we're really pleased to have you this morning.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here. Well, first I'm going to share a short backstory about how this talk came to be. In that Jeremy Henderson was here, I believe in November, talking about culture and all of that, and ways to really make your organization work. And one of the things, who was here for that talk? Okay. And so one of the things that Jeremy advised, which is really true, is whenever possible, get rid of your jerks and all toxic workers and all of that. Well, that is a lot easier said than done. And at the time, I was finishing up one of my applied neuroscience programs, which again I was able to do as a teaching assistant and not have to pay the $15,000 for the program, which was quite nice. And so I figured, okay, I'm writing a paper on how to work better with jerks. Why don't I propose this to Ernie and I can leverage this? Because especially in organizations, you have jerks, especially in small organizations where oftentimes the founder is very dynamic, very smart, very passionate about what doing, but not exactly the easiest person to work with. So, first of all, can I see a show of hands? How many of you have ever worked with a jerk? Okay. How many of you are working with a jerk today? Okay, so not as many, but some. Okay, great. And how many of you consider yourself a jerk, not all the time, but some of the time? Okay, yeah. So one person's jerk is another person's fancy, whatever. So we're going to talk today are just some good coping mechanisms for dealing with jerks based on neuroscience and also behavior design. So I'd like to do first, though, is go around the room, and if you could just tell me your first name and anything in particular you'd like to get out of this today, or what kind of drew you here. So I can start with you. Great to see that you all have a certain level of self-awareness, because it's a very, very good first step. We are going to talk today about a lot of coping mechanisms that you yourself can do, because you really can't. Changing a jerk takes a long time process unless the jerk shows that they want to change. And then I want to just specify a couple of caveats by background. Now, I am a coach, consultant, and facilitator and trainer. I am not a neuroscientist, although I've studied applied neuroscience, and I'm not a psychologist. So I may be calling on Brian if we run into particular issues that I can't answer. But I want to start by giving some background around how the brain is organized, because that should help put a lot of this into context and should help you with some good coping mechanisms. And you guys on this side might not be able to see this as well. But basically, this is a 1-2-4 model that Evian Gordon developed. And it's really helpful for you, self-awareness and kind of understanding how we all act the way we do. So the brain's number one job is safety. And our unconscious is always scanning, looking for danger. Because even though we operate in a very modern world, our brain still is how we developed years ago. And in many respects, people often don't like to hear this unless you're an animal lover like Paul and me, but we're not that dissimilar from our dogs and cats and other mammals, other than the fact we have a prefrontal cortex, which gives us the executive function. But again, we're always scanning for safety, and that's why it's very easy to feel threatened. And so we feel threatened, jerks feel threatened, everybody feels threatened. And if you put people more in a fear state, they get, the traditional, you hear about, who's ever heard of flight, fight, or freeze? Yeah, that's true. That's what happens to us. So we're going to think about this, and we'll think about some coping mechanisms for that. We have two ways of processing information. Our conscious, which is like the size of a pea, compared to our unconscious, which is the size of the Milky Way. And our unconscious is always working. A lot of people refer to this as System 1, System 2, or which is the Kahneman's. Hello, there's room over here. So this is the conscious piece is basically the prefrontal cortex. So very, very tiny compared to our unconscious, and this is the most evolved and relatively new part of our brain. This part of the brain also tires really quickly. I don't know if anybody's heard some of the stuff that says goldfish now have longer attention spans than humans, which we do tend to flip, but basically, if you want to catch somebody's attention, like 15, 20 minutes in a meeting, it's really about as long as people can concentrate without needing to switch to something else. And so when we get tired, when we get hungry, when we get caught up on something like that, we can tend to not be able to regulate our emotions very well. So that's really, and a lot of people do not realize it. And when you start understanding how the brain works, you start understanding that a lot of things that we do in the work environment are not very brain friendly and help and contribute to a lot of the problems that we'll have. So then, and just stop me along the way if you've got any questions. Then the other important thing to think about in this 1-2-4 model is that there are 4 processing modes. The physiological, which is, again, always operating, basically with all our chemicals and all of that, nerve system in the body. This keeps us alive. The emotional, which is where in the unconscious, it's where the emotional things. So we're much more emotional creatures than we want to often admit. The thinking piece, the processing mode, and again, this is the prefrontal cortex, the consciousness piece. And then the self-regulating piece, which is the most difficult to do, and a lot of people don't know how to do it. And this is where we're going to talk this morning about how we self-regulate ourselves. And this is where, and this kind of, people I'm sure have heard about emotional intelligence. Yeah, okay. So this is, emotional intelligence and self-regulating are very similar. Okay, so this is like very, very basic brain stuff, but it gives you hopefully a context for what we're going to talk about next. Any questions or comments? Okay. So hopefully I'm not going to threaten you. I'm going to try to put you in a neutral or positive state to understand this stuff. So we're going to cover basically 3 ways to regulate your emotions in the context of working with jerks. So the first way to do it, let me back up. It's really important that you acknowledge this when you get upset, because research is showing that if you suppress your emotions, that stiff upper lip and being stoic and all of that, is actually very bad for your health, both short-term and long-term. Because basically what it does, if you try to not express emotions and just say, this is not affecting me, and just keep it all inside, your cortisol levels start rising. And that will contribute to lots of problems later on. You're going to start having, your immune system gets affected, it might affect your sleep, it might affect all these other things, which can, so for example, if people that you see are always stressed and always have colds, that's basically why. They're really hurting themselves. So you do want to express your emotions. So what we're going to talk about is on a progression. Labeling is one of the easiest ways to deal with this. And when you label your emotion, all you say, if somebody annoys you, pisses you off, you say, I'm angry. You don't have to say it out loud, you just say it to yourself, you acknowledge it. Does anybody do that now? Okay, great. Great. Because there's some real benefits to doing it now. So basically, when you label your emotion, you take a pause and you give yourself, you like put a handbrake on your prefrontal cortex, and you are able to kind of stop yourself in the moment and acknowledge how you're feeling, and then kind of give yourself a way to kind of calm down and figure out what to do next. I mean, you could also count to 10, but again, that labeling gives you more self-awareness about exactly how you're feeling. So those of you who label, do you have some favorite emotions that you tend to use?
Nothing you can say out loud.
Okay. Because this is another way to be creative, because generally there are like, there are like 8 basic emotions?
Depends on whose model you're looking at.
Okay, yeah, it really does vary. There are lots, probably hundreds of words that you could use to describe your emotions. So I actually went to, of course, our favorite tool, an emotion word list off of the intranet. And there are things like confused, uncomfortable, overwhelmed, helpless, isolated, weary, humiliated, all these things. So that too, if you can think about drawing on a large number of different words, that will help you act as a break. Give you a little bit more control. Yeah?
So is it better to be more vague when you're labeling these emotions to yourself?
No, more specific. Yeah. Because that, again, coming up with a specific word will give you more time to think about, because you might say, okay, if I'm angry versus if I am charged up, you might want to think about acting differently. Okay? Anybody have any questions about labeling? Okay.
But Liz,
Yeah.
on the labeling,
Yeah.
on the labeling issue, then it wouldn't be fair to say that, if I characterize the meeting, if I label, there's like a dominant label, and then there's like maybe 200, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the guy was a jerk, and, I'm kind of angry about this, and I'm also kind of, so there could be other things that I sort of contributed, might be secondary to the primary.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. And again, this is not going to get you very action-oriented by labeling. However, just the process of labeling gives you a sense of being more in control. And that being in control is going to help you deal with the situation better. Hopefully we'll have time, because I'm going to share. Hopefully I'll have time to share with you yet another model that's really helpful in that regard. But I want to talk through these other 2 things first. Okay, the second one is distancing. And again, this is involving you. But what you do with distancing, you try to figuratively distance yourself from the situation. So you might refer to yourself in the third person and say, okay, if Liz were to do this over again, what would Liz do differently? And again, you're taking control of the situation. The other person you might think would be totally in the wrong, but by you being self-aware, it still helps you. And the other thing about distancing is, again, because the value of distancing is oftentimes we'll try to ruminate on these things over and over and over again. And that gets us, if it gets in our head and just gets caught up, we get into this endless loop that doesn't do us any good. It just makes us more and more upset. So by distancing, you're able to kind of break that pattern. The other thing that's often good about distancing is to say, okay, if I were a fly on the wall, how would I be looking at the situation and thinking about it in that respect? The other thing is, if you have trouble distancing, view yourself in not only the third person. So again, continue that, as I mentioned before, but also think about yourself, okay, what would one of your favorite cartoon characters do? What would Wonder Woman do in this situation? Or what would one of your business heroes, what would a Warren Buffett do? What would a Tim Cook do? And interestingly enough, that can also help you break the paradigm that you were in and look at it from a different situation.
Well, okay, but what if my favorite character is Wile E. Coyote and he pulls out a big thing of TNT and blows up the other person because that's what's going through my head?
Then at least should give you a good chuckle.
Well, I'm laughing, but thinking about it right now. So.
Yes, so that gives you a good chuckle, so that breaks the thing. Then you can think, okay, who else besides Wile E. Coyote could be helpful to me in this situation? Whose power could I call upon? Yeah. So if you have figured out by now that these are basically mind tricks, that's exactly what they are. However, what's fascinating is that, one of the things that we've been able to look at the past 10, 15 years is brain scans of live human beings, which were not possible many years ago, and those are the fMRI machines. And so the research is showing that when you're able to do these things, you really do calm yourself down, and you're able to cope much better. And again, the other thing I would say is everybody's brain structure is similar, but everybody's brain is unique. So it's really important to practice these things to find out what works best for you, because different things are going to work differently for different people. Okay?
I think they both apply to, you're kind of looking at this from if you're in the meeting or having to work with someone that is, is sort of aggressive and taking that, the role that you're being forced to react to. But then also if you're the person that's getting upset, has the dominant position, and is about to project sort of that jerk mentality, in both cases it's important to take a step outside of yourself, look at yourself, analyze what part of you is reacting based on your feelings as opposed to based on your sense and your thinking. But it applies to both scenarios, is what I'm...
Oh, it definitely applies to both scenarios. And oftentimes, let's say, I coach a lot of jerks. And these are people who are highly, highly qualified, and they've pissed off a couple of key people in the organization. And they're somewhat aware, but not fully aware.
Yeah.
So a lot of these techniques are really helpful for that. However, they've come to me because they realize that they need to change. If you're dealing with somebody who doesn't feel that need to change yet, it's kind of hard to convince them. Now, you could sometimes get them to convince that they're a jerk, and that sometimes too will give them a bit of a pause. Okay. Any questions or comments about distancing? Okay. The third one is reappraisal. And on a continuum, we're going from the smallest to the biggest impact. Reappraisal is basically you reinterpret a situation. And some people find it hard to do. Sometimes it's often it's better with practice, and it's also better to do it practice in normal situations, and then you can call upon it when you really get into a difficult one. But with practice, you can get really good at it, and it really, really helps. So I'm going to share with you a personal experience I had a few years ago in Northern California, which to this day is still, I think, pretty bizarre. I reappraised it so well, though, that I now kind of like miss the situation. So basically what happened was we had a new neighbor. Our other neighbor had lived in the house for, 30-some odd years and died, and a new woman bought the home and did massive renovations. And she wanted to erect a fence between our two homes, and our two homes were very close to one another. And the community, or the city law, only permitted a 6-foot fence at the lowest place, and because this was a hilly area. And she wanted to go 16 feet. And we said, no, because we really didn't want the fence anyway, because it was blocking a nice view and all of that. So her fence ended up, because it was a hilly piece of property, ended up being very jagged. And it turned out, from her point of view, it was not working well for her at all, because the lowest point of the fence was at her bedroom, but it was also at our bedroom too. So to compensate for the fact that this was a low fence where she wanted a really high fence, she installed not one, but 4 video cameras. And one video camera looked right into our bedroom. Yes, video surveillance camera. So I immediately thought, this has got to be illegal. And no, it isn't. Even in the state of California, which does a lot of privacy protection, this was not illegal. If it had been a business, yes, but not whatever. So we had this bright red light looking into our bedroom. And I'm like, okay, what are we going to do about this? This is like really annoying. So we ended up, doing more blinds and all that. But then I decided, maybe, because I was trying to work on, I forget, some project at the time, maybe what I should do is every morning when I wake up, I should tell the video camera, look into the video camera across the way, what my goals were for that day. And I will be sharing with publicly my goals for the day. Well, would you believe I was like incredibly productive? That really, really did work. And I actually was disappointed like 2-3 months later when she turned it off. She kept them up, but they weren't on. But I had just reappraised a horrible situation into this situation. So reappraisal can make a big difference. There are different ways to reappraise. You can reappraise by how can I just look at this in a more positive sense, which is what I did with the video camera. The other is to look at this from the perspective of the jerk. How is the jerk feeling about this, or what's the jerk's situation around this? So, for example, I worked with a woman who was always upset about a jerky person not being there for meetings, always running late. And then she's thinking, well, maybe the person has childcare issues. And sure enough, she did, so she could have a lot more sympathy about that. And she ended up just taking additional stuff with her to the meeting to work on, or calling in advance and saying, okay, you're going to be able to come to the meeting. Okay. And that helped her deal with it. Or even just looking at, are there any other ways to reappraise, to reinterpret this in a positive way? There's the classic, you see the people coming to, all dressed in black. Are they there for a funeral? Are they for a wedding? And again, you look at different things. Does anybody use reappraisal now? Yeah. And how does that work for you?
A lot of times I really am putting myself in the shoes of the other person and trying to understand where they're coming from emotionally, and it helps a lot. I mean, I'm not always right, but it does help.
Yeah, because even if you're not correct, at least you've paused yourself to look at it from their point of view to say, okay, is this going to be something that's going to be better and help me? Yeah, you heard?
Well, if you're lucky, the distance can actually be a literal distance, meaning you don't have to react to the scenario right then.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy yourself some time. You give yourself the ability to do the reappraisal, but then actually apply it for the first reaction instead of the second reaction.
Yeah.
So it's hugely important, and it helps you with future scenarios that, have a similarity.
Yeah. And buying that time is really important, I think, because especially because I was in on a phone call the other day and I realized, oh, this person was really driving me crazy and I was feeling I was about to snap. Then I realized I had not eaten lunch. It was like 1 o'clock. So I said, my prefrontal cortex is like exhausted. I need a break. Can we resume this conversation like tomorrow? And she was fine with it. And like, I dodged a bullet there. And I felt actually much better. Yeah.
I had a experience, raised family, so I had teenagers and stuff, and I had a difficult child. I won't go into great detail, but my wife and I went through a program which was very powerful. And do you ever hear the Bradshaw method?
Mm-mm.
You may have heard of it. It's a very powerful tool, and I think it came from the executive ranks. But it's kind of similar to this, and I think it's very powerful. And I try to look it up, and it's hard to find it. But what it entails is basically, when you get to deal with a jerk, you're basically not communicating anymore. When you get to that feeling, there's zero communication. And what the process is, it's a writing process, but you can do it in your head. And it's basically you assess the situation in 3 levels. You say, this is what I see, this is how I feel, and this is what I want. And it's a very powerful process, and if you start writing that way, it opens communication because you get down to the emotional level to that person. And so it's very similar, and it was very, very powerful. And if anybody has teenagers, I can tell you this is a very effective tool when you have a difficult child that you don't communicate with anymore. And I can assure you that happens probably at least 50% of teenagers. And it's a way to get through to them, and it was very powerful. And there's a lot more to that story, and it was a very successful story, and a very good ending.
Great.
But it's very similar to this, and if you can ever find it, I looked up on the internet. We went to a program in Atlanta to had to learn about this, but it was very powerful. And what I heard is it came from the executive approach to problem solving with difficult people in an office environment. So anyway, it's almost mirrors that.
Yeah.
And I can tell you it does work.
Yeah, great. Yeah, because this stuff does work not only in work situations, but also personal situations as well. The other thing I want to add to what he said is the actual physical act of writing and getting it out of your head can be very helpful. The other thing that the research now shows is that doing it by hand is actually more therapeutic and more helpful to you than typing it out. Because the actual act of writing connects you to your emotions as well as your logic much tighter than the handwriting, than the keyboarding does. Now that may change in another generation, but it is still being shown through the fMRIs that the handwriting piece works better.
Could we define what you mean by the word jerk, or what we all mean by what a jerk is? Because I think there's layers of that, and there's sort of the dominant or strong personalities that are still very constructive in their feedback and interactions, and then there's a line that gets crossed at some point.
Yeah, so I think in some respects the definition of a jerk can be very much how we ourselves just interpret it. But I think there's a real big difference between competent jerks and incompetent jerks. And I will definitely agree with Jeremy that if you've got incompetent jerks, you want them out of your organization as quickly as possible. But if you've got competent people who are not toxic, as in they are not so destroying the fabric of your fellow human beings or the organization, that they could have some value to add. And they could be jerky in different domains. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a great article, it's interesting, this was done about a decade ago in Harvard Business Review. I forget the name of it, something about lovable fools. Competent jerks, lovable fools, and the formation of social networks. And it showed that back then, people would rather work with lovable fools than competent jerks. And because they just felt it was just a lot easier to get along with. However, if you're in a small organization, you may not have that option. But back to the definition, it's really, they themselves had a hard time putting a really concrete definition on what a jerk was.
I think was to, just think about this, what I see in situations like this is, you almost have to sometimes qualify, why people can qualify basically personal and professional. They tend to basically take everything personally, from a professional standpoint. So to the question that Joe asked, and I hate to say this basically, lovable fools are the guys who are going to trade sideways and get nowhere in life. And that's just reality. Right? Because I don't think of, one of the guys I'm studying right now is Elon Musk. He's not a likable guy. Steve Jobs, not a likable guy. Larry Ellison, not a likable guy. But look what they've built, right? So the reality is, back to there's a difference between competent jerks and incompetent jerks. I was at a presentation yesterday where the mayor made some comments, and I sent an email this morning to his advisor and 3 other people basically saying, this is just way off, and unless you want to do this, don't do this. Now that could be perceived as being a jerk for sending that, but that was my reaction. I was driving home going, why did I even come to this stupid thing? Just because it was, just completely turned me off. Because, so that's a case of if you don't know, don't say. So it's not personal, it's more professional, and the city has a brand, and we need to basically stay here. So again, this is a very challenging issue, and now the flip side is basically, and I don't mind calling him out because he's long gone, but the city's had a CIO, and he could never get over the fact that basically the desktop was going away, and it was all going. I'm sorry, the central basically. We've kind of come full circle on the desktop issue. We have dumb terminals and everything's cloud-based. But he could never get the fact that he had no control of what you did with your computer. It was all basically, and so he was just this total jerk. Anytime, and this is when the digital court was being formed, and I was telling him, hey man, Dave, here's what's going on. And he was just brash and horrible. He just didn't want to go in there. That would be and ultimately, basically, he was called and he was removed from the organization. But in a public organization, it just took forever. So there's a difference between the competent jerk and the incompetent jerk, and what I find basically with some of the jerks is they're focused on the end goal. The lovable fools are just focused with, hey, I come to work today, I'm employed and I'm contributing. It's just a different personality altogether, and we tend to call them jerks. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sort of way, because I consider myself a jerk. I would consider basically the consensus builder. Basically, the lovable fool is more consensus oriented, right? And I will start out speeches basically and say that consensus is overrated. 3 sentences down. Now let's go. So it just depends on who your models are and what value. What has my task been to basically raise the per capita? And I've been given some pretty specific tasks, so it just causes me to operate a little differently than people around me who don't study the issue. Right. So, again, I think there are a lot of incompetent jerks out there, basically, and they should be removed.
Yeah. Because people often call me a jerk because I'm very direct. I always wanting to form a society of the people who are too direct, sometimes for their own good. And
But you sleep well at night.
I sleep well at night, and I like to be around people who are high achievers, pushing the boundaries and doing all of that. So you recognize you're going to have some give and take. And I found these things really, really helpful. Anybody else, any comments on reappraisal? There's someone in the back who wanted to say something? Okay, so, yeah.
I was kind of going to ask some of this discussion that we were just having about what does a jerk mean? At least in the context that I've been thinking of it, jerk isn't necessarily an inherent thing to that person. Sometimes they behave like a jerk, right?
Yes, yes.
Like you were talking about, you could be emotional because you're hungry or whatever. So is there a difference between, like we're talking competent, incompetent, and then is there like an occasional jerk? Or,
I think we're all capable of jerky behavior, and I think that's a good point. This is all more behavior-based, and a lot of people do not have incredible self-awareness. A lot of people have incredible passion that they're driven by. And so a lot of this, it's a real a continuum, and it's situation-based. My husband loves me dearly. He is so thankful that we have different last names because he thinks that I act like a jerk. in social situations. I don't always agree, sometimes I agree. But so, and also some of the restaurants there. But at any rate, so it really, a lot of this is just being able to be self-aware and kind of being able to dance with the situation and trying to be as empathetic as possible for people who you admire for their smarts. And that's another way I would say to put it in, and trying to, so the more you pause and look at it from that perspective, the more you're able to, and not take it personally when they lash out at you or do something that you decide is a pretty piece of jerky behavior. Anybody else want to comment? Because we've got a lot of smart people in the room. Yeah.
Well, I mean, presumably if somebody lashes out at you, or whether they're a competent or an incompetent jerk, it doesn't really matter. You're going to have to go into your self-awareness, reappraisal, analysis. But how do you sort of draw the line between that, between self-awareness and self-respect, in terms of like snapping back at them and saying,
Yeah.
don't ever speak to me that way, or that's not appropriate
Yeah,
behavior?
yeah.
Because I think a lot of times, especially like in corporate culture, the expectation is that you just take it,
Yeah.
which isn't going to help with
Right.
any of the good
Which-
feelings.
Yes, and especially if you've got a situation where you've specified for your corporate culture, there are certain non-negotiables, or certain things you believe in, certain values that you want to do. And that's where the leadership of the organization, especially the person who's responsible for HR, HR needs to come into play, because you can start getting into people going off the guardrails pretty quickly. So I'm going to share with you another model here. We've got time for it. So David Rock developed this, what he's called a SCARF model. And it takes this idea of safety and the idea that we're all social creatures. And if Maslow were to have invented the hierarchy of needs today, probably social would be there along with food, water, safety, security, all that other stuff. So basically, what David did with the SCARF model was combine the social with the danger. And it's really helpful for you as individuals. It's also really helpful inside organizations. And it's really helpful to get leaders to be aware of this model. So basically the 5 domains that affect our status, so somebody's rank in the organization. So this is where things can get off the guardrails pretty fast in organizations, because the leader generally has the most status because of the position. But you can also have status in terms of tenure, status in terms of education, status in terms of, certainly in Charleston, you've got status in terms of your family history. Certainty, the brain craves certainty. We don't like to be not knowing what's going on, so we want that. Autonomy, we feel like we want to be able to be in control of what we're doing. And so sometimes when jerks or other people take that autonomy away from us, it makes us very uncomfortable. We look for relatedness, the similarities between people, and we look for fairness. Generally, fairness is very important for people. So in the SCARF model, you can be both threatened by things, and you can also be rewarded by things. So the self-aware good leader is very much aware of how his or her status, his or her knowledge, his or her autonomy, and the fact that they have more of a fairness thing can really, quote, scarf people and make them uncomfortable. And so they look for ways to try to balance that. So they look for ways to relate to people better. And so that can be, in fact, in the whole performance management arena, a lot of organizations, really progressive organizations, are doing away with their formal performance management programs and with ratings, because they realize that ratings really threaten people. And to have those horrible once annual conversations, and instead to go to doing regular conversations with their managers and teaching the managers about SCARF and ways to give people feedback more forward-focused rather than dredging things out from the past. You had a question or comment?
Yeah, actually, it goes back to your, when they flip on you, and it actually ties back to the Baldwin as well. Someone talked to me about when you flip your lid, when they're flipping out, or they're yelling, they're reacting out of emotion, conversation is pointless, right? And so responding back in the moment means that you're responding out of emotion, and so you can't, so you definitely have to address it, like if they flip out, give them time, but then you have to go back and say, okay, that was really, so what happened, and, get to them when they're a little calmer, maybe you can actually talk to them a little bit more. But you have to address it, and then you probably also have to address it with the rest of, if there was anyone else there.
Yeah.
And maybe help them.
Right.
Kind of relate, and, this is what was, this is probably what was going on.
Yeah. And also very much like, here's how I felt, not here's what you did to me. But here's how, what you said, here's how I felt about that. I did not care for that. And then, so a lot of this is taking things more on your shoulders. However, it gives you more of a sense of autonomy when you do that, if you look at it from that lens, from a SCARF model. Yeah.
Another synonym for that, accountability. I think it's a big word, and I think as a leader and manager, you have to always step back and say, what did I bring to the table in this conversation?
Yeah.
What can I do better? As angry as you could be, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But when you're not communicating and you've got a good person in your team, you've got to look at yourself also. And
Yeah.
I think when you do that, like we were just talking about, that's why this method and the Bradshaw are so powerful, because it gives you time to check yourself, but you also have to look at your accountability in the situation.
Yeah.
Because that brings you to a humble place, and then you can communicate again.
Yeah. And for those of you in the room who are leaders, the more you are aware of this and the fact that people don't like to admit how status-oriented we are, but that really, really makes a big difference. And how certain things that you'll do in the SCARF model can really be scaring people inadvertently. And the problem is, which we really didn't talk about, is but when we feel very threatened, we tend to shut down. So we're not as creative, we're not as open to ideas, we're not all the things that leaders want us to be inside organizations. And we tend to get, our physical strength gets better because we've got more adrenaline in our system, more of a rush, but we tend not to have really good peripheral vision, seeing other things and wanting to do things with other people. So there's a real move afoot to make sure that leaders and organizations are very, very familiar with SCARF and are working with it. It's very, very powerful. I mean, so for example, I had was talking to an individual in the Midwest this week who had moved from the West. He's in healthcare, and he moved from the West Coast to the Midwest at a pretty prestigious organization, and he expected it to be really, really leading edge. And turns out it's not, because it's in the Midwest, and things on the coasts tend to be more leading edge, as those of us who are on the coast know. And he is responsible for all the therapy programs. And he was not familiar with SCARF. And as I talked about it to him, he went, oh my gosh, all these doctors I've been talking to as equals. And that might have worked on the West Coast, but it certainly doesn't work here in the Midwest. And I've got to figure out a way to play to their status. And we talked about the fact that this is always a dance with yourself and with others, because you want to remain authentic to yourself. I mean, he did not want to say, okay, I'm suddenly a lower level human being. However, but if he recognized that if he could reach those doctors better by acknowledging their status, he could get some of the other things that he needed to do.
But not just, it got me thinking about just my perceptions of people on the phone to meeting in person. And this will, appreciate, it's also based on race and sex.
Yes.
I've actually had people looking over my head going, hey, I'm here to see Ernst and Andrade, and when I come out like this, they're like expecting a suit, and so the status thing is not just about, in the medical community, it's also about, the expertise, because I've got, just all my friends are doctors and stuff. I can clearly see that, but adding the dimension of, just being a minority, basically, and you can you have those two issues.
Yeah, because this actually, this has been very, very helpful to me navigating Charleston. I mean, I was at a conference, a talk by an esteemed Yale lawyer at the Library Society. The woman who introduced him was a lawyer, mid-30s, very, very well educated, obviously. And he took questions from the audience, which was good to see, because not always the speakers do, but he only took questions from white males. And I'm thinking to myself, like, this is really odd. This was October of 2015. This is strange. And like, why wasn't she like noticing that or anything? And so how I reappraised it was, oh, he's a Civil War expert. In the Civil War, only white males could vote. So that's probably who he decided to call on. I mean, I still think it was odd.
Generous of you.
But I had a good laugh about it, and it's a good story, right? So it does become, as I said earlier, like all of these are kind of like coping mechanisms, and you hopefully you're continuing to push yourself along and push others along. So, any questions or comments?
So I
Yep.
think about it from a really broad term. I understand the process is if you're the jerk.
Yeah.
This process works really well to bring you back to rationality and get you thinking rationally after being emotionally irrational. I'm trying to think about what the goal is when you're dealing with a jerk for these processes. Is the end goal empathy, trying to understand their situation so that you can kind of dissociate yourself with what they're feeling? Or the SCARF method is if we're actually trying to change what they're feeling or dealing with yourself, I guess.
So you've got to start with yourself, because yourself is really the only one that you can control. So if you are able to use these mechanisms, you're able to get greater clarity about who you are, how you deal with people, and how you think. And you may decide as you work with some of these folks that, in my next job or my current job, here's what I want to do differently. And then also look for opportunities to try to teach the jerk some of these things. But you may not get there unless the jerk has an interest in knowing.
Yeah, that's what you said. When somebody's starting to scream at you, they're definitely not thinking rationally at all.
Yeah.
There's really no sense in
And
having
so,
a conversation.
right, and so you just try to excuse yourself from that conversation and just say, can we come back and talk about this later? And they'll probably appreciate that. I mean, generally they do. Because a lot of times when people get into these modes, they don't have a lot of self-control. This is the way they've always operated, whatever. And so, but they realize it's probably not the best way to do it. They're just doing it. So, yeah.
The end game is to have somebody respond, not react. So when you go through the process on your own, and you've humbled yourself as a leader or whatever, or position in that position, and you reach out to that person and with a sense of, whatever process you go through, your goal is for them to respond. Because when they're emotional and they're going through all this stuff and they're acting like a jerk, they're reacting. If they don't respond and you've gone through all this process, then you have a decision to make as a leader is whether that person should be in the organization or not.
So the end goal would be clear communication with the
Absolutely, because, but it starts with your own accountability. Go through this process, nail down what you brought to the table, try to understand that, like I think you said it right, just try to understand that person's position. And that's a humble thing for you to do because you may be a leader or whatever. But if that person doesn't get to a respond level and stays in a reactionary mode, you've got a problem. Because you have done what you need to do and you met your obligation to resolve the situation.
After a certain point, they stop being competent jerks and become incompetent jerks.
Yeah, and they need to get off the bus.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that we tend to think of jerks as just sort of these, these foghorns that are always in your face and it's always loud and condescending. But you can have the calmest, most easygoing person who comes across, as a jerk in my mind, and the difference being that in a business scenario, in all of them, whether it's clients, whether it's colleagues, or any other relationship, the difference to me is always constructiveness and fairness, whether or not the feedback and the conversation is in a constructive manner to help me or to help you. If it's delivered in a way that I don't like, I think one of the things that happens as you get a little bit older in business is you start to be able to see through that partly because you don't take yourself so seriously. But if you can look through, if it's non-constructive, it doesn't matter whether it's yelled at you or it's sent to you in a Hallmark card. It's not constructive behavior, and that's what you have to. I think when it's delivered in a way that is emotionally jarring, it's more difficult to deal with.
Yes, yes, and that's where you're getting the threat thing coming forward.
Yeah.
And in some respects, one thing we haven't talked about is sometimes a lot of leaders can be real jerks when they never acknowledge and praise and recognize people. Because research is showing over and over again that that's what we crave. We crave acknowledgement. We crave somebody to thank us. Sometimes thanks is more important to us than money. And when people do not do that, there was a type of a jerk-like behavior. And the older some of us get, we say, okay, that's just not their style. I'm not going to emulate that. I'm going to try to get my thanks and my rewards elsewhere. But if you as a leader can understand that you don't want to put people in a fear state, but you want to put people in a neutral or toward state, the better off you are. Yeah, but I think we've got time. We're about really over time.
Kind of a question that I would be concerned about is as I'm going through this process,
Yeah.
and then I rationalize it, and then there's the danger of accepting it and not addressing it.
Well, yeah, that's, again, you've got to decide for each particular situation how you're going to address it. And we really didn't have time in a short thing to do that. I can talk to you afterwards. I would be very conscious of everybody's time because we are a little past. So
I'll
anything.
take one more question, I guess, and then.
Okay, but we can talk afterward, yeah. Any other questions? Well, I hope this was a good intro to some very complicated issues, and hope you guys can go forward and be more self-aware and do things that will help you feel better.
Thank
Work
you.
better.
Thank you.
A couple of housekeeping and what's coming down the pike. Some of you guys might know we do these code talks. There are 6 topics, day long, 9 to 4, followed by a happy hour kind of thing. And this has been on my mind for a while, about a deeper dive in some of these issues. So what we're going to do in May, we're going to do 2 of these a year in May, and maybe in October. We're going to create sort of a biz talk, sort of 2 sessions basically during the year that explore some of these topics. I consider them more sort of workshops and interactive. So there may not be 6 topics, there may be 4. So you have and the desks will be back, and they're going to be limited to 20 people, and lunch is going to be included. So it's just come spend the day with us with some of these wonderful experts. So we to the Liz issue, we might bring in a psychologist basically, to talk about workplace issues. These topics are very timely for me. So this is interesting. With Code Camp, I'm looking at doing some advertising. And yesterday I called an ex-boomer basically who's now got a company called Hook Lead, and we were talking about the differences. So everybody thinks they've got a digital marketing now, and nobody's basically measuring it the way, or they don't know how to go to market, so to speak. Oh, you do social media? I got a social media strategy. They don't know about voice. So the next topic, for example, on March, and it's because I'm going to be in India on the 18th, I pulled it forward by 1 week to the 11th. But I told Matt, who's going to present this, that we got to move on with this and do the day long and develop relationships. And it's what I noticed. We all have experiences, and we'd like another half hour just kind of talk about how we would deal with these different situations. And I always say when I get to something, I want to be done in about 10 minutes, and then I just want to open it up for questions. So when I'm in different cities, they know what they want. Everyone is different. And so why don't you tell me what you want, and then kind of I start to fill in the gaps. But I spend just a few minutes. So I think that's a situation where Liz can come and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And then we're going to kind of create a workshop. So for example, every participant would have to come in prepared with their homework before they come in. What are you doing for social media, digital marketing for your company? Right? And let's use you as an example of how effective it's been. And that kind of thing. So we're going to do those, and we've got the And for y'all who don't, the I-5K is coming up on March 14th. From 1,200 tickets, we're down to 130. So, you guys, who, I think it's a great option, just kind of come out and be with like-minded folks. I think that about 1,000 of them come for the after party more than the run, which is just kind of, I call it a runabout and after party rather than a run. And so I think, and again, the feedback in to us, it's very simple. It's easy to remember. It's Fridays at Charleston Digital Court. You'll all come. We see it, topics. But we're going to set the plate basically in the next month for the topics. I would love to have Tom present on, some business planning. I'm in that mode right now, having separated from the city of what are the offerings. We've got the harbor, so I don't need to be doing some of the things that I do. We've got Dig South. Suddenly don't need, we don't put on big national, parties and that kind of thing. So we're becoming more plumbing oriented. How do we fix the things on a daily basis that companies are dealing with? So as an organization, we've constantly morphed. I don't have an 18-person board. If we decide we've got to change comes from talking to you guys. So, then all of a sudden tomorrow it's changed. So, again, just keep in mind if you got some topics that are near and dear to you guys that we would like to, we might actually crowdfund the topics. Here's the 10 that we came. We only get to do 4. Make it highly relevant, highly targeted, a workshop, build some relationships, and then go be productive in the company. So that's something that's kind of coming. I certainly appreciate, it's the beauty of basically having folks like Liz, and these are all things that I need in an organization, as kind of the leader of the CDC and our team, so, there's a certain bias basically when I get certain things across my desk. But mediocrity is not it. So, I think what she's bringing is, is bringing top topics that are very relevant. And we're not going to have 1,800 people in the room. We're going to keep it basically 20 or 30, because I think then we tend to interact. We get more removed the bigger the crowd is, and you get people who are just in trying to sell you an insurance policy, if crying out loud. And so just something that guys can take away. And so I certainly appreciate you coming out. And like I said, the next topic is going to be on digital marketing and actually optimizing it rather than just doing it. And so I appreciate you all coming out. Thank you, and thank you, Liz.